Bom dia, bom dia. Bom dia a todos, bom dia a todas. Nós vamos... Agora parece que sim. Bom dia. Bom dia a todos, bom dia a todas. Nós vamos dar início à conferência do professor Augustin Holl. Mas antes eu gostaria de fazer algumas considerações, breves considerações. Meu nome é Valter Silvério. Eu sou professor titular do Departamento e Programa de Sociologia da Universidade Federal de São Carlos. E tenho a honra, enquanto membro da atual diretoria da ANPOCS, de estar recebendo o professor Augustin. Então, eu gostaria de começar pelos agradecimentos e, em especial, a atual diretoria da ANPOCS, em nome do professor Adriano Codato e da secretária, a professora Mariana Chaguri, por nos oportunizar essa possibilidade de ter aqui o professor Augustin. Queria também agradecer, né, aquilo que a gente chama de retaguarda da ANPOCS, que, na verdade, não é a retaguarda, é quem faz, de fato, as coisas acontecerem, em nome da Gabriela, todos os esforços que foram empenhados para que o professor Augustin estivesse aqui. E dizer da minha satisfação de estar trazendo esse tema, imagino que uma das primeiras vezes na nossa associação, né, e com alguém tão importante, eu diria, em relação ao debate da África contemporânea. Eu vou apresentar muito brevemente o professor Augustin. A gente combinou que eu ia falar só um pouquinho do currículo dele, senão vai o tempo da palestra. E o professor, então, conhecido como Augustin Holl, ele é professor emérito da Universidade de Xiamen, na China, e no Departamento de Antropologia e África, pesquisa sobre África. Atualmente, ele é vice-chefe desse Afro Perspectives, a Global Africa Initiative. Ele é fundador e vice-presidente. Ele foi sucessivamente professor de antropologia na Universidade de Califórnia, San Diego, curador do museu da mesma universidade e professor do African American Africa Studies da mesma universidade, em Michigan, a neighbor. Ele foi professor e vice-presidente do Instituto de Relações Internacionais de Paris, Nanterre, na França. E aquilo que eu considero fundamental é que o professor Augustin presidiu o Comitê Científico dos volumes 9, 10 e 11 da História Geral da África, o qual eu tive a oportunidade de trabalhar com ele mais de 10 anos nesse comitê, na condição de vice-presidente. Então, nós vamos ter a oportunidade, né, de conhecer a forma como tem sido reconceitualizado o continente africano, na perspectiva dos africanos, né, e da diáspora africana. Esses 3 volumes, eles somam, se eu não estiver enganado, 221 capítulos, 10% dos autores são brasileiros. Quando contrastado com os 8 volumes anteriores, nós tínhamos a presença de um brasileiro Agora nós temos 10% dos autores, dos capítulos. São volumes totalmente multidisciplinares ou transdisciplinares, que trazem algumas novidades que eu vou falar muito rapidamente. O volume 9 é um volume de revisão dos 8 volumes, né, especialmente na perspectiva da arqueologia e da história, o que mudou nesse período, né. O volume 10 é o volume sobre diáspora, África e suas diásporas, e o volume 11 está intitulado como África Global, né. Esses volumes estão prontos, eles estão revisados, e é possível que depois a gente converse com o pessoal da ANPOCS. Se tiver e-mails do grupo que está aqui, a gente manda o volume 10. Eu me comprometo a mandar o volume 10 na forma digital, tá? Há uma polêmica em relação à capa do volume, mas o fato é que saiu uma versão, né, de África e suas diásporas em português. E uma coisa importante é que, pela primeira vez na história da Unesco, esses volumes devem sair primeiro em português, antes em português do que francês e inglês, né? Então, com a palavra, o professor Augustin, Reshaping the Narrative as Multidisciplinarity in the UNESCO General History of Africa. Por favor, professor.
Okay. Thank you very much, Brother Valter, for this very brilliant introduction. I wish to salute everybody here and let you know that I'm very honored to be able to share with you the adventure we have, because it was an adventure at crafting the volume 9, 10, and 11 of the General History of Africa. So my presentation today will be focusing on 3 major steps in the process. We will look at what was done and how it was done, and then look at what is being done now, and at the end, projecting ourselves in the future, because life is a process. So the title, Reshaping the Narrative, says it all. It means by the 1960s, when African countries start succeeding in fighting for their independences, the African schools had a history curriculum that was crafted by the colonizers. And it goes without saying that that curriculum was not fitting in the new realities. We have almost the same situation today, because what the major narrative is not fitting with the realities on the ground. So the multidisciplinary perspective has always been one of the key aspects of the project of General History of Africa. So it is a kind of 3-stage rocket, we can say that. In the first stage, it was launched in the first years of African independence, and it resulted in the publication of 8 volumes, published between 1981 and 1998. Stage 2 was launched in 2009 at Tripoli, and was sponsored by the Libyan government at the time. And it is the pedagogical use of the general history of Africa. The goal of the whole exercise was to use the material published in the 8 volumes to craft teaching material for Africans and maybe diaspora schools at a different level of education. It has been partly successful, and it is still going on, because now it depends on different states to adopt what was produced by UNESCO. And stage 3 was initiated by the Federal Republic of Brazil and launched in 2013. It is almost completed, and I hope that by the end of the year, all 3 volumes will be made available in print. So the major actor of the first achievement of the 8th volume was Mr. Amadou Maktambo, who was the Director General of the UNESCO from 1974 to 1987. His quote is really very important to provide the global atmosphere that triggered that big adventure. My life, the experience I had as a teacher and director taught me how necessary it was for the education of younger generations and for the information of a wider public to have a book of history produced by scholars comprising knowledge of the problems and hopes of Africa with possibility of understanding the continent in its entirety. We may say that that is the spirit that still shapes the project of General History of Africa, which is considered to be one of the flagship of UNESCO, actually. So let's go now step by step, because we have to keep time for discussion after this. The initial project was the decolonization of African history. It resulted in this 8th volume. In the 60s, newly independent countries urgently needed a history curriculum to turn the page of colonial brainwashing. In my country, for example, in Cameroon, the national anthem stated in those days as, "O Cameroon, cradle of our ancestor, once you live in barbarism." You may think that it was written by French. It was not written by French. It was written by Cameroonian students in some of the school in that period. That is why the term brainwashing is really important in that case. Today it is replaced by, "O Cameroon, cradle of our ancestors, stand up and be jealous of your freedom." So, but it took some 35 years to change these words. So the second phase, launched in 2009, focuses on the development and the renovation of history teaching in African Union member countries, and the establishment of the accompanying education material intended for primary and secondary schools on the basis of the 8 volumes. It aims to promote and harmonize, and that's really the most important part of it, to harmonize the teaching of this collection in higher institutions across the continent, and to use it for the revision of school textbooks in Africa and throughout the world. So the objective of these 2 phases is to reclaim the interpretation and the writing of African history and to highlight the contribution of the past, present of African culture to the general history of humanity. Phase 3 of the project, which is the one we will be focusing on from now on, the project of the General History of Africa, Volume 9, was spearheaded by the Brazilian government. In 2003, under the presidency of Lula da Silva, the Brazilian parliament passed the law 1063903, making the teaching of history of Africa compulsory and of African Brazilians in public education. So the initiative to launch this new round of publication was at the instigation of the Brazilian government under the presidency of Mrs. Dilma Rousseff. The objective, to publish a volume, Volume 9, dedicated to African diaspora in the world. The first meeting on that new project took place at the expert meeting in May 2013 at Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. What are the modalities of the implementation of that initial project? The UNESCO created an international scientific committee that met in October 2013 in San Salvador de Bahia to decide how to produce the volume 9. The UNESCO gave free hand to the committee to really decide the scientific aspect of it without any interference. So the committee decided that crafting a volume on the diaspora is really needed. But we have to do many things at once because the volume published between 1981 and 1999, precisely the first two volumes were already obsolete. It was almost 40 years of historical research. You have to change the material or the content of the material. If not, it is the history of history. So the committee decided to publish a volume 9 in 3 tomes. The tome 1, we may call them volume in the presentation you have on the screen. Tome 1 was supposed to be an update of the general history of Africa, volume 1 to 8. Volume 2 was focused on Africa and its diasporas, and volume 3 will be focusing on Africa and its diaspora in the contemporary world. In 2017, at the meeting of the International Scientific Committee at my university in Xiamen in China, based on the advice of a person of public relations of the UNESCO, who found that a volume in 3 tomes is quite kind of very cumbersome to manipulate. He suggested just to call them volume 9, volume 10, and volume 11. And that suggestion was adopted by the International Scientific Committee. And from then on, we have to talk about volume 9, volume 10, and volume 11 as independent volumes added to the 8 previous works. So when these 3 volumes will be published, the General History of Africa, UNESCO, will be made of 11 volumes. Now, what is going on now, because we're still trying to have this volume published, it is not a secret. UNESCO has some serious financial issues because some of the key Western members have suspended the contributions when the UNESCO accepted the state of Palestine as a member. So the funding is not always available, but the person working on the project are working very hard to have this completed. But what is important is the fact that the UNESCO always insisted on the status of the general history of Africa as a flagship project. And in the latest meeting in Addis Ababa at the end of last month, of September 29 to October 3rd, the whole meeting of almost 500 scholars from all over the world was focused on the general history of Africa in different aspects. So I participated to 2 sessions, and what is really important for the project we are talking about is that the UNESCO now is moving further to avoid the mistake of the previous step, which is the volume published were not really advertised and distributed in different universities all over the world, but was kept in a storage room. And when the Japanese Director General was nominated, they had to empty, you will not believe it, but they have to empty the storage room and send the volume to be destroyed in Belgium. So some of the volume of General History of Africa never made it in the classroom and libraries of the world. So now the UNESCO wants to take another proactive step, but creating collaborative network and partnership with different universities in the world. And it is one of these projects that was presented, in which this university signed to promote the different volume of a general history of Africa in the near future. And we hope that that will be possible in Brazil, that has a big stake, like all African countries, in this project. Now, let me make a pause and just go back to more general issues. Historical research is in constant renewal. This is probably one of these fields of, I don't know what field of scholarship is static, but anyway, historical scholarship is always in search of new material, new sources to start improving the understanding of the human history on this planet. The emergence of new disciplines like genomics, derived from the Human Genome Project, is completely changing the understanding of human species history, its evolutionary dynamics, and its expansion all over the planet. You probably know, we will not go give you a little glimpse of the detail a little later. So new development in historical scholarship now allow to probe the dynamics of formation and expansion of and extension of languages. In the 19th century, in the 1860s, it was the Linguistic Society in Paris and the Linguistic Society in London have forbidden any investigation of the history of languages because it was considered to be too speculative. We had the parable of what's called again, of a Babel Tower, which presented linguistic diversity as a curse. So to go back to it, environmental science powerfully now open probes of the dynamic of a biosphere. And we can go on and on and on with the listing, but the core message is that collaboration and partnership at different tempos and scales are an imperative for the production of relevant and effective new knowledge. So now let's see how this collaborative role was implemented in the case of the General History of Africa, Volume 9 and 11. Volume 9, just give you a quick outline. The General History of Africa Revisited, that is its title, and it is geared to update Volume 1 to 8. Just try to pause and try to think about it. These are 8 volumes at approximately 900 pages each, published over the span of almost 20 years. The committee is supposed to succeed in updating them in 1 volume. So you can guess how drastic the task is and how selective it has to be. So the originality of a project is anchored on 3 main dimensions. 1, the theoretical engine that sustains the coherence of a project is where we have adapted an idea that was already out there, the concept of global Africa. It is crafted after Global Dimension of African Diaspora, edited volume published by Professor Joseph E. Harris in 1985. He was from Howard University. That concept allows to analyze the history of Africa and people of African descent worldwide within the same frame of references. Meaning, we try to get rid of Africa and its diaspora through the concept of global diaspora, examining the movement back and forth, the exchange of ideas and people from the origin of a process to the present. The second dimension is the formulation of a new systematics of human historical experience. In the Western historiography, it is generally segmented into prehistory, proto-history, and history. And the challenge I don't know if you heard about the speech of a French president a few years ago at the Université Cheikh Anta Diop in Dakar, when he asked to, he said, I quote it very quickly, that the drama of Africans is that they have not yet entered history. And of course, it was an uproar because he was simply displaying his own ignorance. But it is based on this idea of segmentation of a historical time with a before and an after. And going in the after being a kind of litmus test where you become equivalent of being civilized. So the new systematic we have proposes focus on the continuity of human history from the beginning to the present. There is no before, there is no after. We have to articulate the term for practical reason. But in order to emphasize the continuity of human history, we divided human historical experience in 4 main steps: the initial history, the ancient history, the modern history, and contemporary history. There is no before, there is no after. The continuity of human experience is emphasized in that systematic the general history of Africa has adopted. And third, each volume starts with, that's another theoretical innovation. Each volume starts with an epistemological section, part of a reflexive approach adopted that outline the theoretical and empirical challenges to be addressed and formulate how to address them in the light of overarching Global Africa Initiative. So the project is a grand-scale experiment in the production of new historical knowledge articulated explicitly on, articulated on an explicit theoretical framework. Now, let's go in a little bit into the details. In Volume 9, General History of Africa is devoted to the updating and the published Volume 1 to 8. Since the publication of Volume 1 in early 1980s, archaeological, paleontological, and historical research have completely changed the understanding of the continent past. Updating Volume 8 in 1 is clearly a very challenging exercise. And the updating is organized in 4 sections, each of a section being edited by a coordinator. Now let's see what was new very quickly in some of these updating. The genealogy of humans has completely changed in terms of systematics for what it was when the Volume 1 was published. Today, for example, we know, I don't have a pointer, but there's no need to go into details, that during the last 300,000 years, there was at least 6 different humanities in different parts of the planet. We have Homo luzoniens, you have Homo neanderthalis, we have Homo sapiens sapiens, and 5 of them were extinct. Only one, Homo sapiens sapiens, survived with some combination with Neanderthals or people from the Eastern Asia. That was something that was not known to 20 years ago. And some new discoveries are being made again and again. And I'm sure that in 20 years period, Volume 9 will have to be updated again. Another aspect is the reconstruction of a human expansion, which is now well known to have taken place in 2 major steps. One, the initial one called Out of Africa 1, from 2.5 to 1.4 million years, where from Africa, the middle latitude was settled from all across Eurasia, from west to east. And Third is the discovery that Homo sapiens sapiens emerged somewhere in Africa around 300,000 years ago and recolonized the planet in what is called Out of Africa too. And the last one is that all human beings today are of a descent of Homo sapiens sapiens who emerged in Africa and re-expanded with hybridation with some different hominid all along the way. These new discoveries have been resisted by different countries in the world, and the most resistant have been China and Japan for emotional reasons, because the Chinese were taught that they have a descent of the Beijing man, Augustin, Homo pekinensis. And so they really resisted very hard, but the DNA evidence of they founded one of the biggest genomics research in the world by a professor from Fudan University, who took 100,000 samples of all Chinese ethnicities and tried to run the DNA. And he has a sense of humor. When he was asked about the Homo pekinensis as the ancestor of Chinese, he said, and I quote, "I grew up knowing that my ultimate ancestor came from China. They came from Beijing. But as a scientist, my evidence are there. All Chinese have a descent of Homo sapiens sapiens from Africa who arrived in China between 100 and 800 years ago. And the last resistance was in Japan. But for Japan, it was more ridiculous because Japan was settled from China. So the genealogy of human cannot be changed in China and stay the same in Japan. So finally, the Japanese finally accepted that the new scientific evidence show that all humans are connected and are originating from Africa today. So now go to the core. The volume 10 has been the flagship of this new round of General History of Africa project. Sorry, mix it up. Let me summarize about the volume 9. Volume 9 brings to the fore the result of the last 40 years of environmental, paleontological, and archaeological research. As scholarship since the publication of Volume 1 in the early 1980s. It explores the epistemological consideration involved in writing the history of Africans and the diaspora. It provides a digest of general history of Africa, Volume 1 and 8, to allow the reader to have a global assessment of a project from its initial stage to the present. It offers an update of initial history of a continent, synthesizing archaeological, paleoenvironmental, research on human origins, genomics, language mapping, technological evolution, food production, and the emergence of cities, states, and kingdoms. And finally, it presents an update of ancient and modern history of Africa, the encounter with non-African powers with immediate and long-term consequences. The General History of Africa, Volume 10, which has been really the flagship of this three-volume project, Africa and its diaspora, it presents all the dimensions implied in the global Africa concept. It addresses the diasporic phenomenon from both ends, past and present. It looks at identities in the context of contemporary societies. Who is black and where? How blackness is constructed in different parts of the world. You know that in certain society, when you have 1 milligram of black blood, you're black, whatever the color of your skin. It outlined the genesis and present the cartography of a mapping of African diaspora, looked at systems of enslavement, transfer, and distribution of diasporic populations. It analyzes resistance, resilience, struggle for liberations, and fight for civil rights, cultural and technical creativity. The book is organized in 3 sections. As I say, each section is handled by a coordinator. In the 3 sections, it tracks and maps the formation of African diasporic communities worldwide at different time scales, as well as the aftermath, and proceed to attenuate and balance the predominant Atlantic focus with new research conducted in Asia, Indian Ocean, and Australia. And we'll come back to the diaspora, but from the east side, because we'll try to show you what the new development of diaspora study in Asia and the Indian Ocean is really publishing some fantastic movement in that part of the world. It does not diminish the Atlantic side, but from your perspective, you're probably not very well aware of what's going on in diaspora study in the East from here. So Volume 10 offers a detailed and well-documented roadmap of the formation of diaspora community in Asia, the Indian Ocean, and the Atlantic side. Provide a balanced African presence in other parts of the world, in the West, the Atlantic, the Caribbean, and the Americas, in the Northeast, North Africa, and Middle East. Northeast Africans are generally in complete denial about the role of slavery in the growth of the cultures. And finally, in the East, Eastern Asia, the Indian Ocean, and Australia. So finally, Volume 10 brings, for the first time, to the fore testimonies of a life history of singular characters of enslaved Africans, written either by a third person or by themselves in their own words. These are the different itineraries. So this maps shows what are the itineraries that have resulted in the creation of African diasporas in different parts of the world. In the top, we have mostly the old continents, as they call them, meaning Africa and Asia. In another map, we have Indian Ocean and this connection with South Asian nations. At the bottom, we have Atlantic slave trade, which is connecting Africa to the Americas. And the last map presents some of the key social formations, we may call them kingdoms if you wish, that was part of African history between the 15th and the 19th century. So let's shift a little bit to give you a kind of snapshots of African presence in Asia, and then we will shift to questions and answers. So here is a sample of a presence of Africans in Asia. We call them generally Afro-Asian. And there is an African-American researcher who have spearheaded this research. And he summarized them in his book, Irizorundo Rashidi, My Global Journey in the Search of African Presence in Asia. So you can see that there are different books that have been published with different titles, and we will look at the different communities that emerge from these movements of force or free movements of Africans in Asia. African people in Asia, past and present. One of the largest groups is with the CD populations in India and Pakistan. The CD population in India and Pakistan are a descendant of a Bantu from East Africa. their ancestors created free communities in forest areas, established influential principalities such as that of Janjira. You can see the fort of Janjira, which is one of the slides, and such as the Janjira with its impregnable fortress, and that of Jafarabad in Kathiawar from the 12th century on. So they succeeded in creating their own independent kingdom in some part of India. As the African presence is well documented in the Arabian Peninsula, in Turkey, in Iran, and in China and in Southeast Asia. In Saudi Arabia, for example, there are 3 million black people, but you don't see them. They are also very important in southern Iraq today. And they are Afro-Asian in Iran. And so that in all of these, mostly in Turkey and in Iran, there are some cultural movement of Afro-descendants from this area that start reclaiming the past. But there are some paradoxical things happening from time to time. In countries like Iran, the Afro-descendants don't want to be associated with Africa because of they're afraid of a backlash from the Parsi Iranian-speaking people. So the situations are very, very different. In Turkey, it is now open, the association of Afro-descendants that are organized, but in other countries, they are totally underground, we may use. So you have different presentations of black people in other Asian countries. And here we have some pictures of the beginning of in the middle of the 19th century in Beijing. We have a Manchu lady as a meal. And the photo was taken by Edinburgh-born John Thompson. He set out for Asia in 1862, and over 10 years, he chronicled the life with his photograph from royalty to vendors. And here he has he takes this picture of upper-class ladies who are having their lunch in Beijing, and you can see there is a black lady there. This seem to have an enslaved status. So things are very different in different parts of the world. African prisoners in the Philippines, in fact, before the Philippines was totally an island inhabited by the expanding Homo sapiens sapiens from Africa, was initially all black populations. And today there are still some group of Filipino that, as you can see in the picture at the bottom of the screen, that have keep the skin colors because they living together in different parts of the country. And in Indonesia, at the end of 19th century, early 20th century, we saw some opera dance singers who have some African body features. The African presence in Japan has given some movies. You have heard probably about the Black Samurai and so on and so forth. That person really existed, and his biography has been reconstructed quite precisely. He was enslaved and belonged to a Jesuit priest, and he was purchased at the East African coast in Kenya probably, and it was a time when the Jesuit was very active in expanding the Christianity in Asia and a different part of the world. So when he arrived in Japan, his master died, and he was given to a samurai by the time of conflict between different powerful families in Japan. So that's how he learned to fight the Japanese way, and he was speaking fluent Japanese. when his master was killed at the battle, he became what is called in Japan ronin, meaning a samurai without master. And his story stopped there because nobody know what happened to him after he lost his master. Some suggest that he was returned to the Jesuit and he died anonymous. So you have different presentation of dark-skinned people in Japan history, some of photographs, some of artistic representations. But the presence was never as high as in the Middle East, but there was some African presence in Eastern Asia. So that volume bring all these, of course the Atlantic is absolutely well represented in the volume, as Valter said, the contributors from Brazil and Latin America has really increased significantly in the new volume. But what we wanted to do with that volume is to bring these different areas of diaspora together in the same book. And we're really impatient to have it published because there is nothing equivalent in historical scholarship in the world today. And finally, Volume 9, Global Africa Today, is articulated also in 3 sections. It focuses on the contemporary history of Africa and the diaspora, dealing with current challenges and addressing emerging issues like gender inequalities, environmental policies, urban growth, and youth problems, and so on and so forth. So the feature topic range from a critical assessment of cultural foundations of global Africa to current variegated, meaning combined, mixed identity constructions, as well as the place and role of Africa and diaspora in the globalized world economies. The globalized world is really being challenged right now. So the assembled paper focused on current ideological and political history of a continent from the perspective of global Africa rationals. You can guess the Pan-Africanism behind it. The emergence, expansion, and transformation of Pan-Africanism, social movement articulated on African identities, and geared towards civil rights are particularly emphasized. The contribution addressed some of the core challenges of a continent, particularly population and rapid urban growth, the place and roles of youth, women increasing assertive roles in public spheres, religious revivalism, as well as the emergence of vigorous and dynamic art and cultural movement. So let's project ourselves in the future now in the last few minutes. The world demographic projections that are shaking the world today suggest that the world will be African. Sort of more than half of the world population will be African and young by 2100. I'll always say to my son that I will leave my cell phone so that they can send me some news when I'm on the other side. And so based on this fact, we move in a new territory. The concept of future history is taking hold. It is not a fantasy, but you have 2 different readings. The future history can be science fiction, imagining a new world out there by 4200 and so on and so forth. So in science fiction, it refers to plausible societal scenarios based on certain assumptions. But in historical research, it is derived from decolonial studies and refer to new writing of history by previously dominated and marginalized people and groups. The UNESCO General History of Africa is a good example of what we may call it entry to a future history. it is well known that official history are written from the perspective of a dominant, or as say in West Africa, when the lion will be able to tell the stories, it will challenge the stories of the hunters. And the third option to be relied upon is data-driven evolutionary scenarios, also called prospectives. And in this case, based on world demographic projection for the year 2100, we will have different things like this. The world map projects population growth from 2010 to 2100. They say the dark blue countries are those that will be having a percentage of population growth by the order of 200 to 1200%. So the dynamics, the demographic dynamics of African country is a kind of rebound from 1,000 years of enslavement. So the consequences will be a reshaping of a world population that is extremely significant. It is already taking place in our eyes. India is now the most populated country in the world, as predicted by this model. But the second one will be Nigeria. And China will lose half of its population. And this goes with adaptation of economies, despite all the artificial intelligence and so on and so forth. Of course, production can be totally automatized, standardized. Artificial intelligence can take care of that. But who will buy the good produce if you have no people? So the consequences will be very important. And if we look at the growth of country by country, comparing 2017 and 2100, can see how things change with among the 10 largest countries in terms of population. You have Tanzania, Egypt, Ethiopia, a Democratic Republic of Congo, and Nigeria. 5 countries in 10, in the top 10, will be in Africa. And there are prediction that cities like Lagos will end up having 50 million inhabitants. So nobody can really think how it will be possible to handle in the next few years. So in terms of global population, this is the graph that suggests in pink the contribution in the bottom graph. The pink represents the population in Africa compared to the population of the rest of the world. Approximately half of the population of the world will be based in Africa, and young, less than 30 years for 70% of the population. So the economic consequences predicted, as we will not have time to go into details, but things will be fluctuating significantly in the next century. China is probably geared to be the dominant economic power, but it will not last for very long, because with the drop of population, it will go down. And the US, despite his anti-immigrant policies, will open the gates for immigration in the next 20 years and will catch up and will come. If things work as predicted, if they do not self-sacrifice, we will become, by 2010, they will still come back as a first industrial nation in the world. Thank you very much for your attention.
Bom, se a gente chegar até 2100, né? Nós não vamos chegar, mas se o globo chegar até 2100. Mas o fato é que existem, em relação ao continente africano, a Agenda 2063, né? Que é uma agenda importante que nós, de uma certa forma, estamos envolvidos nessa agenda do continente africano 2063. E 63 nos parece que tem relação com o surgimento, né, da Organização dos Estados Africanos, e que em 2063 fará 100 anos, né? Agora conhecida como União Africana. Primeiro eu quero agradecer ao Augustin e dizer por que nós estamos envolvidos. Para o continente africano, nós somos a 6ª região do continente. A América é a 6ª região do continente, né? De acordo com a União Africana, o Estatuto da União Africana, a reconstrução do continente africano depende da diáspora, e a diáspora, de alguma forma, depende do continente africano. E essas relações, como vocês podem ter visto, envolvem, né, o Brasil, desde algum tempo atrás, não muito tempo atrás, desde o governo Lula, vamos dizer assim, do primeiro governo Lula, mais efetivamente, a participação do Brasil no financiamento dos 3 volumes, né, dos 3 novos volumes. E eu diria que a cooperação técnica hoje é algo extremamente importante na relação entre Brasil, África e China, né? Qualquer similaridade com os BRICS é mera coincidência, né? Bom, então, essa é a primeira questão, quer dizer, o que significa ser parte da 6ª região para os africanos, como é que nós, né, no continente americano, entendemos isso, por um lado, e, por outro lado, o fato de que o Brasil é, de fato, o país, digamos assim, que os africanos têm maior proximidade. Quando eu estou dizendo africanos, independente da região ou da herança colonial, né, linguística. Então, acho que isso é uma questão muito importante, como é que a gente se relaciona, a importância dessa discussão da diáspora africana, do meu ponto de vista, está justamente aí, né? Que tipo de relação nós iremos estabelecer? A segunda coisa que eu acho muito importante na apresentação, e eu participei longamente desse processo, passando por vários países, eu diria, como eu fiquei surpreso de ver a presença africana, né, e até reivindicações mais recentes, como se diz, que se reivindicam da diáspora africana. Tem um livro interessante do professor Andreas Hofbauer sobre o CIDIS, que vale a pena procurar, que é muito interessante a pesquisa que o professor Andreas faz, e os CIDIS reivindicam a sua identidade africana a partir de 2006, ou seja, tem menos de 20 anos, né? E eu fiquei muito surpreso, concordando aqui com a fala do professor, quando eu fui a primeira vez em Xiamen, entrei num templo e eu vi um Buda preto, né? Falei, nossa, mas que absolutamente escuro, né? E como aquela imagem está normalizada entre os outros Budas, né? Lógico que as coisas mudaram, mas o que mais me surpreendeu foi um comediante negro chinês, né? Bom, eu fiquei muito surpreso porque ele apresentava um programa infantil e também um comediante japonês, quando estive no Japão, negro, apresentando programas infantis, coisas que a gente não vê no Brasil ainda, né? Embora percentual enorme. Mas eu queria que o professor falasse um pouco dessa perspectiva da mudança da datação histórica, porque, do meu ponto de vista, isso tem um impacto epistêmico de enorme monta na forma como a gente pensa a história, né? E aqui nós trabalhamos muito com essa ideia de pré-história, né? História antiga, né? Queria que você comentasse um pouco, enquanto eu abro para quem quiser fazer alguma questão. Eu acho que é importante, a gente pode estar conversando um pouquinho mais.
Yeah. Can you translate for me?
You can talk about initial,
Okay.
the impact in epistemology.
Okay.
Way.
All right. Okay. So, yeah, I will try to really explain the implications of the new systematics of human history, because it really shaped the mind of people when they deal with others who are different. When you consider that there is, let's take the case of a national anthem of Cameroon, that those who came before were living in a certain circumstances, you call them barbarism. It is based on the evolutionary schemes that were developed by anthropology in the 19th century. So you have at the beginning, you have savagery, and then you have barbarism, and then you have civilization. That's how Europeans think at the time. And so all the other nations that were not urban Europeans were somewhere below civilizations. And history for them was equated with civilizations. And in fact, when you asked to, we were taught at school that history begins with writing. And so the nation that do not have, you can guess, the logical consequences. If you do not have writing, you are not civilized. And it was implemented even without thinking about it. So when you just make a 5-minute stop, say 95 of the humanity didn't have writing. A little bit in the Maya, the Egyptians, maybe a little bit of Mesopotamians and the Chinese. These are the 4 areas of the world where there was a writing system initially. So does that mean that all the others were out of history? So that's really the kind of situation that is changed by the new systematics, in the sense that we accept the continuity of human history from the emergence of the early humans to the present. At some time in the past, there are accelerations because population can grow faster, and this necessarily implies change of structure. It can also slow down when you have epidemics and population die. So the epistemic consequences of this change is that we are in the same boat from the beginning to the future, and we have to handle it to the best of our capacities. Can I have the microphone?
Tem microfone.
Oh, we didn't plan it.
Hi, Professor. Yeah, it's me here. My name is Camila. I'm a PhD student in political science. And first, I'd like to thank you for your talk. It was fascinating to hear, about the history of us all and the origins in the Homo sapiens in the African culture. That's really amazing, and it's really a pity to hear, the president of France saying, the Africans want to be part of history, and then you show us this, absolutely massive showcase about how Africa is actually in the origins before whatever the Europeans were actually claiming as their history of the universal history. But my question is actually a little bit of a challenge, but you understand, how do you see the presence of women? So you see the body of a man, we see the history of men, and to be a bit anecdotal, if you talk to children, like the other day my daughter asked me, my son asked me, so you have the history of the Homo sapiens, thinking about the word homing, like homo for men, and she asked me, what's the history of women sapiens? So I was wondering, how do you see the women in this part of history, and how do you see the intersections when you talk about gender studies as well, in analyzing the history of Africa and all the African diaspora throughout like the whole of the world? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a difficult question. So, but let's say that history was not gendered in the past, in the sense that it was almost equated with masculinity. And there are subtle changes that are taking place now. But in evolutionary terms, you need these two for the population to grow anyway. So the expansion does not go in, we can't go in these details, but it is possible at some specific stage to trace the branching with mitochondrial DNA of the Y chromosomes. In some populations, it is really possible to make the difference, the descent in the male line or descent in the female line. In fact, what really revolutionized the study of modern humans was the investigation of a mitochondrial DNA in the Berkeley laboratory 40 years ago. It was realized that because it is one line process, it was possible to track the mother of humanities. Male was completely absent from the process based on the genetics at the time. So to answer a very complicated question, I mean, in long-term evolutionary processes, you need the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA for the population to reproduce normally. But as history is written, it was written by male scientists to begin with, and it became gendered for quite some time. There are efforts to correct it, and I think General History of Africa is in the right direction in that corrections.
Bom, o professor faz mais de uma, Valter? Depois pode passar para ele?
Pode falar, pode passar.
Pode. Bom, primeiro agradecer a organização da mesa, professor Valter, e também a palestra. Acho super importante ter uma discussão sobre a história geral da África dentro desse evento.
Yes, I do.
Tá escutando? Okay. Bom, agradecer a organização da mesa, do professor Valter, e você, a palestra. Foi muito bom te ouvir nesse evento, né, de ciências sociais, porque eu acho que muda a maneira como a gente encara as nossas pesquisas e o que a gente realiza. A minha pergunta tem a ver com história oral. Nos documentos, quando se organiza o projeto de História Geral da África, nos anos 60, a história oral era uma questão que era apresentada como central e era dado um valor muito importante. E isso gerou muito impacto no debate sobre a história oral na segunda metade do século XX. Tem alguns textos que são clássicos no campo que descendem diretamente dessa discussão que é feita, inicia-se lá na História Geral da África. E a pergunta que eu queria fazer para você é como que você avalia, né, já que você falou que existe uma perspectiva multidisciplinar, né, e você deu ênfase na questão do genoma, da pesquisa do genoma, eu queria saber como que você avalia a questão da história oral, nesses 8 primeiros volumes e nesses 3 volumes que estão sendo organizados a partir de agora. Se isso tem relevância ou não. E aqui, é claro, eu sou Samuel, sou professor do Cefet, da Unirio, e eu tenho especial interesse na questão da história oral, né? Faço pesquisas dentro desse campo. Obrigado.
Okay, thank you. There are many levels in that question. And let's start from what I understand better. Let's say that in terms of the first crafting of a general history of Africa was really prepared by many workshops, collection of data, organized in different parts of the country. There are a series of volumes that was available, maybe still available in UNESCO, that are the sources of the result of this meeting of different experts at that time. The 60 was a period of questions about the relevance of orality in the writing of history. And researchers like Jan van Sina and many others have really crafted solid methodologies of how to use oral sources history. There are some critical methods, and they're generally comparative methods. In order to use oral history, you have to have many sources that converge. But it's not always possible to have different sources because, as the saying goes in West Africa, an older person who dies is a library that burns out. So sometimes we simply have a unique source of some history. I will give an example. The Manding Charter was recovered through a process of critical analysis of different segments of oral history of the Mali Empire. And it was a collective investigation that turned it finally into a very important historical document. It claimed that by 1230, the first human rights declaration was made in Mali, not after the French Revolution. And today there are still some historians who feel that because he was in oral form, he's totally irrelevant. And so to move forward, but now to go to the general history of Africa, the methodology of orals are completely internalized by all the researchers. We don't have that problem anymore. What we have is to have a critical apparatus that can help filter the information and turn it into history. But as you know, history writing is culturally bounded. And if the pretense of an objective history is just what? A pretense. Because history is written from a certain perspective at a certain time. And when the time and the perspective change, you can have a totally different access to historical experience. And that is what the general history tried to do. It is to, let me use it, decentered the general perspective by shifting it from continent to places to the globality of African experience worldwide. So we can access different kind of information that are not isolated anymore. You probably, maybe you know, but probably know that the Haitian sent a contingent to help Ethiopian fight against Italian invasion at the beginning of the century. So these connections are really very strong, despite the fact that we all have been mostly colonized, but we can use this general history of global Africa to rebuild connections and to rely on these connections to move forward. And in that sense, the Brazilian experience is really crucial. It is the biggest African country out of Africa. And we really count on the mobilization of Brazil resources. And you probably didn't read it yet, but you know, there is a new convention between China and Brazil to start building the C919, which is the big Chinese plane that is trying to challenge Boeing and the European company in airlines companies. So I mean, as a militant, the Pan-African is a global South, so it does not have to surprise you. But I do think that based on the conjuncture we have today, it would be foolish to stop using the same mantra. The United Nations is in deep crisis, and I don't think that it can be reformed. And but that's my take. I mean, we have to keep moving, using our connections to build, based on the Agenda 2063, the world we want to live in. Yeah, thank you.
Bom, antes de passar para A impressão que se dá quando ele faz a exposição tão linearmente é que foi tranquila a vivência no comitê científico. Posso dizer para vocês que não foi tranquila. Tá? A questão de gênero atravessou o tempo todo as discussões, houve alterações importantes, não suficientes, nunca são suficientes, mas houve alterações importantes. Inclusive na distribuição dos capítulos, da direção dos volumes, da presença das mulheres nos fóruns epistêmicos, né? Então, isso foi bem... Agora, o que chama atenção nos volumes é, de fato, a multidisciplinaridade. Os textos sobre genética, sobre genoma, eles são muito interessantes, e muito pouca gente sabe que parte importante das pesquisas nessa área são de africanos. Quando você fala em Nature, tem vários artigos de africanos nas últimas 3 ou 4 décadas que têm publicado nessas revistas altamente indexadas do mundo. Então, com isso eu estou querendo dizer que talvez uma das áreas mais importantes de conhecimento hoje no mundo é exatamente o continente africano, ou os cientistas africanos. Por favor, desculpe.
Boa tarde, é uma honra estar aqui participando dessa mesa belíssima, dessa apresentação que só enche a gente de orgulho para a gente entender que a gente precisa mesmo, através do conhecimento, né, chegar onde a gente quer, num mundo diferente do que a gente tem hoje. Mas, trazendo para o Brasil, eu acabo de sair de uma mesa, né, de um debate onde a gente não se vê, né, a gente não se vê na representação das mesas, e eu creio que nós, povos pretos e povos antirracistas, temos que nos incomodar quando a gente chega num evento belíssimo como esse, né, em várias edições, e a gente vê uma mesa totalmente branca, falando de algo que é sobre nós, de uma população de maioria de pele preta. Então, a gente precisa se incomodar, porque a gente precisa, enquanto povo antirracista, porque eu concordo exatamente com o senhor, a gente não vai conseguir fazer uma luta de um mundo mais igual somente por nós. Então, nós precisamos de homens, mulheres, pretos e brancos nessa luta. Então, quando a gente encontra uma mesa num evento enorme como esse, totalmente branca, a gente, não só eu como mulher preta, mas todos nós que somos antirracistas, precisamos nos incomodar. Mas eu não quero falar sobre isso agora, né? Eu só queria trazer essa reflexão, mas o que eu trago é um outro elemento muito importante quando o senhor cita o hino de Camarões, né? A alteração que teve, e eu me remeto ao hino brasileiro. Quantas alterações nós precisamos fazer nele, né? E aí eu venho para a Lei 10.639, que o senhor citou, que fez 2 décadas, e a gente ainda tem um currículo aqui no Brasil totalmente europeu, totalmente branco, onde as nossas crianças não se veem em muitos livros ainda, né? A gente teve um declínio, né, dos livros didáticos, onde a gente ainda consegue encontrar alguns materiais com muitas pautas, né, que não encontram, não debatem o racismo, né, que silenciam. E eu, como professora, eu costumo falar com os meus alunos que o silêncio é uma grande arma de poder. Então, eu queria que o senhor falasse um pouco sobre isso, né? 2 décadas da Lei 10.639, e a gente ainda tem um currículo muito europeu, muito branco, que não, e aí uma sociedade ainda que vive sobre o mito da democracia racial. Essa é a verdade do nosso país, né? E, então, eu queria que o senhor falasse um pouco sobre isso, né? Como a gente tem uma lei linda, que é a 10.639, e ainda um currículo em um país tão racista.
All right, thank you very much for your comment. And I do think we're still struggling to make sense of this word. And the events going on. I mean, they are not very helpful, the events going on, because we see that the term used is double standard. And it is really systematic now, and everybody can see what's going on. It is not necessarily a bad thing, because it works in our conscience to understand that what we believe, when we believe to human rights, freedom, equality, and so on and so forth, tend to be slogans. When the real stuff is there, people pick the sides. Maybe we have to do the same, and not against anybody, but for ourselves. And that's all. I do think that it's we have to think of the future of our kids, because it is for them that we're working today. For me, it's too late, and we have to shape the mind. They are full people as they are, and the world is there, and we have to take it. And that's why history is extremely, extremely important. And the pedagogical use of the general history of Africa, if we can make this material available to every single school on this planet. The paradox of the history is that there are mostly North European countries, in fact Germany today, and part of France, who are interested in the result of what we did in the pedagogy, in the project Pedagogical Use of the General History of Africa. There are a few African countries that have adopted it, but it is not yet implemented. So it is really ironic that the Europeans are much more interested in what we have done, which is the goal to empower our students in Africa. But we don't have to desperate. It takes time, and I will just close by that. I don't know if you have seen the recent vote in the United Nations about the coloniality and the reparations. I was completely stunned, right? More than 20 African countries abstain from the vote or just disappear by the time of a vote. It is absolutely extraordinary. So far, I can't understand it. And it simply means that we have a long way to go, simply to agree to assess the experience of colonialism and enslavement of African people. There are African countries who are happy with that. And so we have lots of work to do. This is where history comes in. And it will happen. I do think that reparation will happen. It may take 1 or 2 centuries, but we have to keep the pressure on and on. Thank you very much for your attention. We have limited time, and thank you to my brother Valter, and thank you for having listened to me for so long.
Bom, nós é que agradecemos ao professor Augustin e espero que a gente continue aí na nossa parceria. Só a título de informação, nós estamos trabalhando na organização de livros a partir dessa fala para a educação básica no Brasil.
So what did you say?
We work in the